Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today in our UN Behavioral Science Week webinar on UN entity experiences embedding behavioral science into their organization. So this webinar is about how entities are going beyond one or two projects, thinking about how to more systematically apply through the application of behavioral science. Suppose you don't know who I am. My name is Mary McLennan. I am the Senior Advisor on Behavioral Science to the Executive Office of the Secretary General. I'm also the lead of the UN Behavioral Science Group in the UN Innovation Network. Okay, so I mentioned that this is a UN Behavioral Science Week event. So this is one of there are still a number that would take place throughout the week on topics ranging from peace and security through to artificial intelligence and health. So lots more to explore. I encourage you to check out the agenda, and I'll put the links in the chat shortly when I stop sharing slides. So a little bit about the UN Behavioral Science Group. If you aren't familiar with it, we bring together over 1,000 UN colleagues from more than 60 entities in 110 countries. So there's quite a lot of interest and demand when it comes to behavioral science across the UN. Colleagues really range across geographies and types of places they work, through the domains, also with respect to their experience with behavioral science, ranging from brand new through to seasoned behavioral scientists. In terms of more senior levels of support, we've also had a number of statements and signals of support from the Secretary General. This is just one statement which speaks about behavioral science being a critical tool for the UN to progress in its mandate, and also strongly encourages entities to work together to apply behavioral sciences, which is what we aim to do in the UN Behavioral Science Group. So if you want to engage with behavioral science across the UN, I'll share again in the chat shortly a few links for you to do so. So you can read the UN Secretary General's guidance note, which covers quite a bit more of the Secretary General's vision with respect to behavioral science. There are a few other documents there as well, including a report and a guide. You can also join the UN Behavioral Science Group, so I'll include the link to do that. As I said, anyone in the UN can join. You can also join as somebody outside the UN as an observer, and again, the link will be in the chat. And finally, you can follow us on Twitter if you would like to follow more real-time updates on behavioral science in the UN. Okay, so now on to the content of today's session. So we will be hearing from a panel of 3 speakers from across the UN about their experiences, as I said, applying behavioral science and embedding it into organizations. We do ask you to put your questions in the Q&A box, and also look at the questions in the Q&A box and upvote those of your colleagues, or hopefully have a conversation that's meaningful to the audience today, and this will enable us to do so. Okay, so we're joined today by 3 colleagues who, if you're in the UN, you probably have come across at least one of these people over the last number of years with respect to behavioral science. So we'll hear from Ana Maria Munoz-Boré from the World Bank's Embed, also called the Mind, Behavior, and Development Unit. It's within the World Bank's Poverty, Equity, Global Practice. We'll also hear from Claire Hobden from the ILO, who is a behavioral scientist, and she's also a specialist on domestic and other vulnerable work. She's been working for many years in the ILO across this and many other spaces. And we'll also hear from Vincent Petit, who's UNICEF's global lead in social and behavior change. And he'll speak to, again, the work across UNICEF in terms of what's happening there. Okay, so I'll stop sharing slides, and I will ask our speaker, our first panelist, to come in with a question to explain a little bit about, it'll be Vincent first. You want to come in, put your camera on? Great, thanks. So Vincent, within UNICEF, what does embedding look like, and what's worked, what hasn't worked? What are some challenges you faced along the way? I know it's been a few years of you really progressing efforts, and what's happened over that time?
Right. Thanks for having me. I think for us, embedding means that UNICEF programs across the board relies on more evidence focused on people's actual lives to make our programmatic decisions and to make our investment decisions. So it's more about pushing a vision about what international cooperation should be doing to be efficient and useful, rather than a gimmick to make what we do more trendy. The reason I'm mentioning that is that it's walking a very thin line to push that vision when we know how mesmerizing sometimes nudge presentations can be. I just want to say we're still in the process of embedding. UNICEF was very late to the party on behavioral science. 3 years ago, we had 2 pilots and a draft document. We leapfrogged today, apparently, according to the last report of the SG office, we are top 3 out of 51 UN entities, which is good. That push was coincident with the shift we had from a focus on communication towards social and behavior change as an approach, because we care very much both about the S and the B in social and behavior change. So I want to recognize the balance that we need in UNICEF to not lose track of the importance of social change and the values that we stand for. So UNICEF, it's 17,000 employees and 450 SBC staff. So we're really talking about organizational change at scale here. So obviously the only way to do that is institutionalization. And I think the only model, but we can debate that, is the complementarity between the building diffused but shallow capacity across UNICEF and complementarity with a more narrow group with a deeper expertise that can support them. Initially, we started with a lot of convincing the organization that we need to improve, conceptualizing the framing, defining the way forward, and getting buy-in from the management, which was to me the most important point. It's not because something is the right thing that people will do it, and I think we of all people should know that. So convincing decision maker has been throughout the most important element. The problem is that we are low on the food chain in UNICEF. So it was a lot of advocacy, quite relentless, using the right arguments, including sometimes playing the competitivity card, like your organization is going to lose traction, using our own tactics on the leaders, and also, I guess, be aware that we're competing with others. If you're trying to change anything within your organization or grow something, you are likely to at least partially take something from someone else. So it's important to be aware of these power and territorial consequences about growing agendas. The way we did it was a very systematic approach, about 45 concurrent initiatives, hundreds of staff, more than 50 partners involved, a few $1 million dedicated to it. So it was a long and tiring process, I have to say, with a lot of work. Focused on institutionalization. So we started with the strategic plan, and then we went into the machinery itself with corporate monitoring system, embedding in the sectors. You have to go deep into the processes, the heavy processes that makes our agencies, and then build a few assets. We have a lab that we built. We have non-binding contracts with a few behavioral science companies, and then we have a new dedicated staff. I think what has worked well is the anchoring in the sectors, explaining to the health education, child protection colleagues what's in it for them, how we're going to help them achieve their results instead of pushing our own agenda. And finally, how success would look like. I mean, obviously, I like when I see new UNICEF policies, strategies, frameworks, or whatever coming up with good quality SBC components. But what we really want is that the investments and the decision made in the countries where we work are based on a better understanding of the people we're trying to serve. So coming back to where I started, that's to me the main objective.
Great, thanks for that, Vincent. Lots there to explore and lots of themes I think we'll hear about from the other panelists today: buy-in, strategic plans, how did you do all of this? So thank you. Now I'm going to turn over to Claire from the ILO to answer a similar question. What does embedding look like for you? And what is, oh, there you are. And what are some of the successes and challenges you faced?
So I think the ILO is generally in a very different place from the colleagues on this call. Generally, we're at the beginning of our embedding journey, and we're also taking a very bottom-up approach. And I'm going to explain a little bit why this is. Originally, we started out just applying it to domestic work, which is the area of work that I specialize in, and I coordinate a global program. So it gave me a scope of action in which I could actually exercise some amount of control. Through that work and the network of colleagues who are working on that topic, I was able to develop what I was calling the coalition of the willing. These were people who had projects, who were open to innovation, who were inviting innovation, who really were looking and hungry for new methods of improving their impact on the ground. And I happened to be carrying this very interesting new tool called behavioral science that they were interested in. And so we built collaborations that way, which at once sensitized colleagues in other departments, and at the same time developed our experience in how to apply behavioral science on the ground to this particular sector. So we also then had to figure out how to integrate behavioral science into the, let's say, the theory of change and the way of operating of the ILO. I'm sure each UN entity has its own specificities. For us, we are a tripartite organization. It means that we have to work with the governments, with the trade unions, and with organizations of employers in the countries where we're active. And so we had to think about a way to integrate behavioral science into that model, which was actually a very interesting process because it gels pretty well with this notion of stakeholder engagement within the behavioral science frame, where, actually building knowledge from the ground up with stakeholders is really privileged. So that actually worked out really well, but it took a little while also to figure it out. And all of this put together has resulted in developing a knowledge base really on the topic of domestic work. And it's also built the capacity of the colleagues who are working on it across the field, who I have to say that, none of them are officially working together. None of them are part of a singular team. But it means that collectively we're planting seeds in different programs, in different departments, and in different countries around the world where behavioral science can be further picked up. All of this has worked better than when we tried to jump straight into the deep end, meaning a very expensive behavioral science field experiment that required maybe high-level clearance or engagement. I think when we tried to do that, it normally backfired. And so it's taught us that, starting with these grassroots kind of initiatives was really helpful to kind of set the base. And then generally also that what we can expect from research and implementation is really not necessarily the silver bullet, right? And I think it helps the colleagues to understand as well the scope of what behavioral science can achieve, both in terms of effect sizes, but also in terms of the challenges in carrying out research in countries at various levels of institutional development that can't necessarily carry a full behavioral science field experiment or intervention, for example. So, and again, I think the big takeaway that we've had so far is how important diagnostics are in the stages of a behavioral intervention to develop our core knowledge. And it was also a really useful entry point for the colleagues in general, since doing diagnostics was something that they were already somewhat familiar with. So we just had to integrate the behavioral science component.
Interesting. Thanks, Clara. Lots for that. Like very much from a grasp from the bottom up grassroots approach, and to see how you've been able to do it is fascinating and really parallels a lot of the experiences we're hearing across entities today. Okay, so next over to Anna Maria from the World Bank. What is it like from your standpoint in embedding behavioral science, and what are some of the successes and challenges?
Well, we're called Embed, right? So we've tried this quite hard. So probably different than or related to Vincent and Claire. We started from the big bang that was the World Development Report in 2015, right? That the bank basically took a stand to say behavioral science matters for development policy. So we had technically the declared intention by the institution to get moving. However, from the intention to action, things took a little bit more time. We materialized as a unit formally about 5 years ago. And actually, we recently completed a retrospective of what it has been like. And similar to what others have said, we started from a low point, like and very opportunistic, what are the low-hanging fruits? What are the activities that will allow us to show quick wins and the value added that we have? And then move to a more strategic approach where we are now. And we similarly went from identifying early champions, the likes of Claire, that had programs that could use our work or were interested or behavioral science curious, to now having a wider net of collaborations. After implementing over 100 projects, and probably now our numbers say that we've trained over 10,000 policymakers and colleagues on behavioral science, I think that we've learned that we have to focus on the added value. So we always saw Embed as a complement and not as a replacement. So we come to not to say that behavioral barriers are more important than structural barriers, but how can we help you breach whatever the last mile challenge is? How can we identify and use these tools for diagnosing what's missing on why things are not working. So how can we use this to sort of like enhance impact? And through that, we aspire for behavioral science to be part of the toolkit or the language that all our colleagues speak, not only us, but how they can use this as a tool, as a thinking tool, as a design tool. We've learned that what matters is not only the why, but the how. And there is a huge barrier in like, okay, I know why I want to do this. I kind of know what I want to do, but I don't know how to implement it. And we've deployed a heavy team to kind of work with teams on the hows. And in many cases, that is where things fall apart, where things are problematic. We also now, I mean, after we started with this kind of like ad hoc firefighter team time of approach. You need us, we go. And it was normally as like, oh God, I have no take up on this project, or why is my communication not being effective? Now we try to start early on, ideally at the design stage of an intervention of a project, and try to embed throughout the design process and the implementation process. However, we have a menu of talk to us that starts with a coffee. You want a coffee? We'll join you for a coffee and just bounce some ideas. You want us to take over from you? We'll take over. Which allows for our colleagues flexibility to how to relate to us. We're not an added burden, we are support. And I think the final lesson that we've had is that we meet our partners where they are, government, colleagues. So we've spent a lot of time on toolkits and trainings and resources and capacity building, adapted to the capacity and the constraints that our colleagues or our government partners have, and not the ideal perfect behavioral science project. And I mean, what Vincent said is completely right. You need champions, you need money, you need space, and it's a kind of like a Goldilocks game in an institution that is as big and as settled as the World Bank, to find exactly where and how you fit. And it's a constant evolution, and it requires to use a lot of your own behavioral science knowledge to find the perfect space. But embedding today for us is strategic added value on the challenges that the institution is facing, particularly reducing poverty and enhancing equity.
Great, thank you for that, Anna Maria. Really helpful to see how you're able to fit into existing work of partners and how you can articulate that value you add and all the different menus and options available. Okay, so I'm going to take call the other speakers back in. We'll have a bit of a discussion. So I'm going to turn your cameras on, Vincent and Claire. But while we do that, if you wanted to put any links in the chat, I know the Embed, you mentioned all those case studies, Anna Maria, you can put the Embed's website, or Vincent, I know you've mentioned some of the UNICEF, and Claire's published too. So feel free to put those in the chat. I'll also share the UN links that I had mentioned previously. Okay, so now on to a bit of discussion amongst our panel. We've seen a spectrum of entities. There are different entities, different approaches, some common themes, some things different. I'll turn it over to you. Maybe I'll start with Vincent. Do you have any comments or reflections on what Anna Maria and Claire said?
Yeah, a lot of things resonate. I think the coalition of the willing is literally a sentence that we've used multiple times as well. There's a combination of a hard and a soft approach to make that work. So the coalition of the willing behind the scene is very much important. And what Claire said about embedding in the theory of change, that what I meant by embedding in the strategic plan for UNICEF as one of the main change strategies. This sounds very technocratic, but once you're there, you get a seat at the table. And if there's an evaluation run, you're going to be a component of it. If there is, any assessment process run, you're going to be a component of it. So there's this balance between formal and informal. I agree also that the diagnostics is a great entry point. Any organization has a diagnosis stage in their cycle, the plan development, whatever it is. It's just overlooking sometimes certain social and behavioral components. So this, embedding, typically what Claire said is something that I've been trying to do pretty hard. And on Anna Maria, quickly, it's interesting that, you started from a formal official public recognition of what you're doing, which you call the Big Bang of this World Development Report. We're doing it the other way around. Like, I think we're now trying to get the upper management to come up with some statement of recognition. That's also what WHO has done with the recent World Health Assembly declaration adopted on behavioral science. So that's an interesting difference. And it's also interesting to see that despite that Big Bang, you seem to have had the exact same challenges as we had starting from nothing.
Yeah, not everything's always resolved the Big Bang. Okay, so next, maybe Anna Maria, maybe you want to go over to you. I know Vincent just commented on a few things from your side.
Sure. So yes, I mean, I think that there's no short route to get things done. You have to invest on them. So I think that is, and the big level champions matter because they mobilize the institution as much as they mobilize the budget, right? We started as a word of mouth type of unit. I've heard of you and I'll pass the voice to others. So we've also been held to the highest standard of failures. Like if you fail, it's considered a lot more problematic than all these massive interventions that fail at scale. But it's mostly because we're new. I think that finding a place in the institution has been important. And I think just to add to some question that I just saw in the Q&A, because I think it matters, I did not give any examples, but one of the things that we've invested heavily on is on diagnostics. And we've tried this to move away a little bit from the nudge idea. Oh, just let's do a quick nudge. We're not a nudge unit. We're a behavioral science unit. So we use the insights from behavioral science to these difficult problems. And we do a lot of diagnostic, and our diagnostics are not, we diagnose everything from behavioral to structural. We just approach a problem and start asking the questions like, okay, what's on the way? Why are people not signing up for this program? A question that we get all the time. Zero take up. Last week, we were talking with Brazil colleagues who are like, we have all these beautiful programs and we have no take up. And we have the financial incentives. And we have made the case on why does it matter for people. So why are people not registering? So we go back to ask people, well, what's happening here? Like, what do you think is the problem? Do you know about this? And we try to use this kind of like open model to try to understand the drivers of behavior, motivational, structural, and others. And from there, design. Design whether it is an information campaign or whether it is an overhaul of the program. And it's not, and I think that is probably to say, it does not always work. Right. It's also about timing. So in Haiti, we did this big diagnostic on why people were not going to shelters during hurricane season, which you assume, well, shouldn't everybody go to a shelter? And we tried to understand what were the barriers to even access the shelters. What did people think about the shelters? What did people think about being with their neighbors in shelter? And what did they think about the communications to tell them when the risk was there and how they felt the risk assessment? We did the same in Sri Lanka. And we tried several types of actions, including tapping on the scarcity mindset and other ideas of psychology of poverty and others, to start the warning process well ahead, to start the exposure to the shelters well ahead of hurricane season. So by the time the problem was in front of them, they already had the knowledge and they already had addressed some of the barriers that could be on their way. So I think that this is one of those, like, start with a team that wants you, but identify the when and the how, and not only that, like, oh yeah, behavioral science will save your life.
Thanks for that real talk, Anna Maria, about how to apply behavioral science in different contexts. Maybe over to Claire. Then after this, I might come back to the panelists. Maybe we'll go through a quick example of how you've applied behavioral science to make it a bit concrete for some of the audience members who maybe want an example. But Claire, do you have any reflections or responses to Vincent and Anna Maria's comments?
Well, I mean, I think I would say that it's aspirational for us at this point. And I think we learn a lot from, I mean, I learn a lot from hearing the interventions and the experiences of others at our sister and brother UN entities. I find that in the context of the ILO and speaking a little bit to, I think, one of the questions that came up in the Q&A, there's I mean, we're just in a particular context, right, where there's a level of leadership that is interested at the moment in behavioral science. You know, at a high level, there is an interest, but it's quite difficult to break that. I would even call it a status quo bias in a sense. You know, things are the way they are now. Everybody's working really hard on what they're doing now, and it's quite difficult to break away from that to create something new. it requires a lot of energy and effort, right? So thinking about these ways of simplifying the process, making it easy, applying behavioral science principles essentially to actually making the change that you need in your own organization is something that that I think maybe summarizes a little bit some of the experiences that Vincent and Anna Maria have been sharing.
Great, thanks for that, Claire. So we have quite a few questions coming into the chat, so feel free to put them in and to vote with questions of colleagues as well. Before we go back to my questions for the panelists, I did want to say, because we did have a pretty highly voted question, people wanted to hear from you an example of work that you've done to kind of illustrate what your organization does when it comes to behavioral science. So it could be very briefly, maybe an area of works, a little bit on the methods, and kind of what you do overall. So maybe you go back, start with Vincent again, and give an example of some of your work.
Yeah. Two examples, actually. We've done a lot of nudges, choice architecture type of projects to start with, mostly on immunization and health, uptake of services. We've done a lot of human-centered design as well to improve services, and we actually tend to think that HCD is very much part of applied behavioral science in UNICEF. But the things that to me at the moment are the most interesting is just the behavioral studies, the behavioral analysis. We have had a tendency of going to default solutions without understanding the problems. That's why I was highlighting investments and programmatic decision, because for decades and decades we have shortcuts to campaigning, blasting messages to try and solve certain issues. We've run some very in-depth behavioral analysis on violence against children, child labor in Lebanon, violence against women. We've done that in Zimbabwe, in Senegal. We have a handful of now very solid research that are not necessarily projects, but they are supposed to be the basis for making the right decision to design the projects. So this is what we're doing, a mix of all of that at the moment.
Great, thanks for that. Shows a spectrum of methods too. It's not all just one approach or way of working. Anna Maria, over to you. Do you have a few examples or one example of the many over 100 that you've run in the World Takes team?
I mean, we've done plenty. So just to echo Vincent, the diagnostic for us matters a lot. We are agnostic on the approach. We use both quantitative and qualitative data collection tools. We also look at administrative data. Recently on sanitation, we actually look at the government guidelines to understand what was and how things were implemented and designed that may have prevented the sanitation program to be completely successful. And then we move into design, and on the design, we co-design with our counterparts. And this is the part when I say that meet them where they are and speak and bring them to speak your language. We sit them with us to think about the problem. In many cases, we take them to the field for the design elements. So I remember my colleagues in Turkey, for example, for the employment, youth employment program, they had never been to their job centers. Several of the people at the central offices had never visited a job center at the peak of rush hour, where there were like hundreds of job seekers trying to collect employment benefits, trying to register for employment programs or facilitation programs and others. And the experience of being there and understanding why, for example, a conversation between the job counselor and the individual was not possible because it was crowded, it was loud, and do you want to talk in front of other people about your challenges finding jobs and how many times you've been rejected? No. So I think that those things take you a long way. And in the co-design, we first give them a quick training on what are we looking at, why we don't think that what they've been doing is wrong, what can be the value added, and what perspective can add. So we focus heavily on the policymaker mindset as well. And then we proceed to what is feasible to implement that is something that can be sustained. And I think that is the other bit that, I mean, I'm saying this not always works, right? Sometimes we hit the jackpot and sometimes we don't. But what we can implement with them and with their systems and structures. So a perfectly, beautifully designed intervention that requires for everybody to have a smartphone in Kenya will not work. As much as beautiful as the intervention is, and as much as we think that that could be the way to do it. So we also adapt to what is feasible to implement, and that will probably be maximizing and sustain from the government side, what they can continue doing not what we will do as we're there and then we leave, but what will last.
Great, thanks. So lots of key themes about making assumptions about human behavior and also making things that actually last over time, not just doing the interesting, fun behavioral science experiment, but doing something that's meaningful and feasible in the context. So lots there we can explore, but I'll go over to you, Claire, for an example of your work, and then we'll go back to some other questions for all of you. But Claire, please come in.
Sure. So I think I'd be an example of somebody who is like, I'm a behavioral scientist who's embedded in a particular program. And I think that's a really important way to maybe frame it. I might be a client in a sense of the Embed team if I were at the World Bank. But being where I am now, I think the way we've moved forward is to identify two essentially behavioral outcomes of interest within the topic that I cover, which is domestic work. On the one hand, we have Social Security registration. So we use this as an indicator of formalization, formal employment being also a gateway to what we call decent work. So it's our main policy objective as the ILO in a sense. And so we've done concrete research, interventions, diagnostics in a few countries, Zambia, Guatemala, Argentina, all towards the same behavioral outcome of interest, towards Social Security registration. And there's a huge amount of interest in this area. So I'm in conversation with many other countries about how to get this off the ground elsewhere. On the other hand, there's a second behavioral outcome of interest, which is the promotion of fair recruitment among domestic workers, notably how households select employment and recruitment agencies that bring in domestic workers. And so this relates to another very important area of interest for the ILO and for human rights in general, which is prevention and elimination of forced labor and trafficking. And this we've been doing in Hong Kong. And so in Hong Kong and in Argentina, two different behavioral outcomes of interest, but we've been building up our knowledge base by doing several experiments or diagnostics on the same behavioral outcome of interest. So for example, in Argentina, we started out with a behavioral intervention to formalize domestic workers. We sent a letter to employers of domestic workers to encourage them to register their domestic workers to Social Security. It was a behaviorally informed intervention or behaviorally informed letter, sorry. And we worked together with the government of Argentina to implement this letter. And the findings were very interesting. It was a field experiment, so we got very interesting statistically significant results that were valid internally and externally. So that was a really wonderful experience. And that was just the first step. After that, we continued to collaborate with the government of Argentina and developed further research, this time more on the side of the domestic workers. The first stage was really targeting employers. Now, in collaboration with the UN Innovation Network, we're able to do some more research on the domestic workers side to better understand what the barriers are from their perspective. And I think it's very exciting because now I think we'll be able to expand that research across several countries in Latin America, which might give us comparable data then on the Social Security registration issue for domestic workers across the region. So all of this to say that, I think it helps us reach our objectives. If this is, also an aspect of embedding on two levels. It helps us reach our national policy objectives and outcomes. And on the other hand, it's helping us build a global knowledge base, which is on a new target group, let's say, in a new domain of application. And in that sense, hopefully building our capacity, our knowledge capacity.
Thanks, Claire, so much in there, especially with the comparability across countries. There's some potential to do a lot. So now I have a sense of what each entity is doing in terms of embedding and some other projects, kind of how they work. I would like to maybe go back to our previous format of kind of a more intimate discussion, which is myself, I guess. So next, maybe I'll go to Anna Maria for this question. So Claire and Vincent, turn your cameras off for a second. You have a bit of a break. Anna Maria, so now that we've discussed a little bit about how you embed behavioral science and through Embed, as well as projects, what do you think is an important factor to successfully continue in applying behavioral science? And are we actually having impact in doing this? Maybe some comments and questions around that.
Buy-in. I mean, as much as I think that for us, showing results and having people speak on our behalf, whether it is our country directors, whether it is the governments that we work with, whether it is our sector colleagues, like, I mean, the bank is a massive institution that works on all sectors of development. When our agriculture colleague or our energy colleague comes and says, it's been great, this was very useful, that actually buys us the credibility that we need. And I think this is one of those that I want to equate to. There is this idea that we normally work with the beneficiaries, and that as much as we target them, their mental models, their mindsets, their social norms and others, we're going to achieve the most change. We have now discovered that actually you need to work with the policymakers and with those that implement the policies, as much as you need to work with people. We cannot just hope for changing people and for them to be the actors of all the change that is needed for them. So creating the structures that facilitate that for us has been a lesson in our projects, but also a lesson in our existence as a unit, that we actually need to invest in creating those structures that will support our work. And I think this has been partly as how we organize ourselves. Basically, we come as I said, as a package help, and we're a trusted broker. We sit in the unit at the World Bank that is tasked with the institutional mandate, which is to eliminate poverty and inequality. So we take no prisoners, right? It's not that we are the team that has the vested interest on advancing one agenda versus the team that has the vested interest on advancing others, and they're like debating the budget. We need the budget, but we're neutral on those priorities. We keep basically working on compromising and being very aware of the trade-offs of sometimes doing things in a way that may not give you the perfect academic publication, but will give you the good result for the government. And basically trading on the dialogue and the type of things that we know. The other thing that I think for us has been a huge lesson and we see us helping us stay and remain relevant as a unit and in our next iteration is this focus on the challenges of basically getting policies to be more effective and more efficient. The fact that we actually come to support that, not to replace, not to tell you that you're doing things wrong, but to help you achieve the goals that you're after, is actually seen as really important by our counterpart as well as by our colleagues, because that is the mandate. The mandate is not to use behavioral science. The mandate is to do better policy work and more evidence-based. And we're just another way of evidence. The bank is an institution that swims in data. And I mean, we have access to tons of data, but we don't have sometimes the lens to how to look at that data differently and to even break mental models or biases that we might have or policymakers, colleagues will have. So I think those are really important lessons that we've taken as we keep growing. And the final one is that also we tend to say that we're not sector experts, right? I'm not a nutrition expert, but I learned how to understand what are the issues that the nutrition colleagues deal with and what are the things that they have to approach and address on their daily work to be able to help them more. So as much as I ask them to meet me halfway, I also meet them halfway, and we invest quite a bit on speaking the other side language as much as we want them to speak our language and understand what are their concerns and what are the areas that they have been struggling and working on, to recognize that they have already a lot of expertise and knowledge.
Great, thank you for that, Anna Maria. I think it kind of touches upon a theme that we're hearing quite a bit from you and from others, this idea of humility that we often talk about in behavioral science and in so many ways, and just not always knowing the answer and engaging with different partners to get closer to a solution. Okay, so next over to Claire for a similar question. thinking about the ILO and your experience there, what do you think is needed to successfully advance behavioral science? Yeah, what would you share with respect to that question?
Well, I mean, I think the next step for us is partly to just continue what we're doing in a sense, right? I mean, I feel like even though we've already been putting some amount of work in, that we're really just at the beginning of what we could achieve in terms of the knowledge development on this particular sector, on these particular outcomes that I mentioned, right? And to me, I mean, one, as a researcher, but also as the technical expert in my field who's responsible for progress in my field, I'm very interested in selfishly, so to speak, continuing to go deep on my area and to see how we can really just maximize behavioral science to improve outcomes for this group of workers that's particularly vulnerable. I have to underline, that we're really applying behavioral science here to a group of workers that's very vulnerable, that's very invisible, and it's giving them a lot of visibility. I don't think innovation is what people normally think of when they think about domestic work or the women who are working in poverty. So I think in terms of the next steps, there's a lot of interest for me in going deeper on getting that research and also learning more ways and figuring out how to integrate the actual target groups, the domestic workers, increasingly into our actual research as a form of empowerment. We just came off of the women's empowerment panel that went just before this one. And I think it was very interesting to hear a little bit about how behavioral science can actually transform the stakeholders themselves when they're engaged in the process. So I think that's an area that maybe not, it's maybe one very particular version of embedding, but I think an important one to actually carry out the mission of my particular organization. So there's that. There's building the finer portfolio, a finer knowledge of behavioral science as it applies to domestic work. There's the aspect of sort of building the capacity of our stakeholders, and then I think the other element of what we've heard some of the other colleagues talking about is the need to build up the capacity of my ILO colleagues. So with all of these people who've shown interest, to see how we can take it to the next step to actually provide training so that they can actually oversee behavioral science work. They might have more autonomy in hiring behavioral scientists to carry out work. We might be able to develop more profiles, basically with the Human Resources Department, to hire behavioral scientists into teams, or at least to hire people who, carry that expertise as well as another technical area of expertise that's of interest to the organization. And then, of course, there's the elephant in the room, in a sense, is, how can we eventually take this to scale? And I think, that is something that still, finding the right strategic opportunities is something that I think is still going to take a little bit more time. Finding the champions at that level who are not only interested, but who are willing to stick their necks out to promote it at a higher level is not necessarily that easy. And I think that if we want to see it brought into other departments, into other areas of work, it will just simply be essential for them to do this, because I won't be able to service all of the departments as my own mini embed unit. So I think that's a little bit what we're faced with going forward. And I think I may just add one point, which is simply that at the end of the day, I mean, we're really working again to expand our to improve our effectiveness, right? And I think I'm echoing a lot of what Anna Maria was mentioning about the need to change at the policy level, to create change at the policy level, and to really work with policymakers. I think the work that we've been doing with the government of Argentina has been really exciting in that way. And I think that bringing these insights to other governments who we have contact with regularly is also, I think, a very promising way and important method to take forward. So I think what we need to do there is develop our capacity a little bit more to engage with them, to present to them the work that we're doing on behavioral science, to hold what we call tripartite meetings, to also bring them in and engage them a little bit more, as we did in Argentina, on what they can do to bring behavioral science I just came off a panel this morning, a workshop that we had with the government of Malaysia on this exact question of increasing registration of behavioral science, increasing registration of domestic workers to Social Security through behavioral science. And I think there's just going to be more and more appetite for it. So hopefully that visibility will also give us what we need to get more active support from higher level management.
Great, thanks for that, Claire. Lots of engaging themes, and kind of relates back to many of the theme that's been, I think, in every session we've had is partnerships and how to engage with government. So yeah, a lot of it definitely comes back to that. So thank you for raising that. And then many other points you did as well. Now, yes, Vincent, thank you for being so proactive. Over to you. Where do you see things going in UNICEF, and what's needed to really progress your efforts?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we need leadership, champions, money, capacity, all of that's good. I think I'd like to flag that we probably need a responsible use of behavioral science in the sense that we need a proper vision that builds on ethics, on transparency, on accountability. The reason being that there are many traps that we need to avoid. There are pitfalls to promoting behavioral science, ranging from basic misunderstanding to people believing that it's a silver bullet, which we have all experienced, all the way to actually promoting slightly dangerous ideology, in my opinion. When we use BSI to let people think that there are always alternatives to public regulation and put the responsibility on people to change, that's slightly dangerous. The most complex problems do require policy change. UNICEF work on many complex problems, complex issues like FGM and child marriage. We want to nudge people out of female genital mutilation, right? As well as we won't nudge people into trusting their governments, because that requires a long and genuine collaboration process. And similarly, green nudges, we can think about them, but I don't think opting out of plastic cutlery on your cell phone is going to save the planet. But there are things in behavioral science that will help tackle these big challenges. A proper understanding of how our cognitive processes prevent or favor large-scale climate action is something very important. For example, why are we all boiling frogs, right? Or more evidence on the incentive structures, explaining why those in power don't rise up to the challenge. So in my opinion, this responsible use is really using, for those who know the debate and article I-frame, S-frame, it's really using the I-frame to inform the S-frame, which is understanding the behaviors and how people make decisions and unpacking them to find the right way to do, even if that thing to do is actually very structural in nature and policy related, and have the courage to say that. It's more of a problem-solving approach most of the time. I feel that I'm more advocating for evidence-based approach than anything else. Lastly, on the same line, I think we need more inclusiveness in our approach. Going back to UNICEF's, it's important not to lose track that what we're trying to fight for is child rights and children's rights and women's rights. And that one of our main approach to that is equity, that we need to focus on the most vulnerable communities and people and give them a voice, and empower them to influence the decisions that affect them. So, BSI also has this slight risk of being a slightly technical scientific perspective put on things. Again, the importance of the S and the B, going back to what I was saying at the beginning, putting people at the center of the choices, a bit more of a militant position, I guess. Plus everything else the colleagues have mentioned. Yeah.
Great, thank you for that, Vincent. Again, some real conversations, some real points about applying behavioral science, and it's not all just what their frameworks say. There's some major considerations to take into account as well. Okay, so everybody come back, put your cameras on. The next 10 minutes here, it's pretty informal, so I'll ask a few questions from the audience, but feel free to engage with each other. Don't let me stop you or just make it more of a discussion. So I'll raise a few that were highly voted from the audience. I see Anna Maria and Vincent have responded to a couple. So if you put a question there, and there might be an answer for you already. So some of the highly voted ones are, again, wanting to know more about senior leadership buy-in. So I know this has come up quite a bit about what is buy-in and how do we get it, but just more around that, maybe more practical. What kind of more intricate things did you do? And then there's another question about if we're how do we prevent the risk of embedding behavioral science, but then perhaps diluting what it is? If we want everyone to do it in the organization, what does that mean for I'm paraphrasing this question, sorry for the verse, maybe the integrity of what behavioral science is. So what do we want to say about that? And then also maybe a bit on the Bird Lab, Vincent, if you could expand on that. Some colleagues want to hear a little bit about the Bird Lab's work. So I'll stop there. Who wants to come in on those 2 points? Just come in.
Vincent, I can try.
Anna Maria, please.
If easier, but I first want to say, Vincent, 100% in agreement that behavioral science is not the solution, and that it as a complement to policy action, standard traditional policy action, incentives, legal changes, and others. And this is one area where we cannot emphasize this enough every time we have this dialogue. Like, if there is no income, if there are no roads, you're not going to make people do things differently. Like, I mean, that's just, it's not the solution, it's the added value to the intervention. In particular, I think here on gender, we've been now working on a policy note on how to use social norms and address social norms interventions. And this is our biggest message on FGM, child marriage, and GBV. You cannot expect women to solve their own challenges, and you cannot just expect a nudge to solve issues. I think on the senior leadership buying, this is one. I think that we've learned both the hard way and the easy way that we have to acknowledge that this is an additional tool. And the moment senior management sees this as a tool that is relevant to the concerns that they want to address, they will support you. I think that the overselling behavioral science works as much against it as it does the underselling of it. And to that, I think some of the ideas of like, not just can solve everything are not always great. And I think that there we've had to argue heavily that we bring value added beyond just a nudge or beyond just a communication strategy. And I think that has bought us quite a bit of support. Also, senior management, as everybody else, they do have their own views. They have their own behavioral biases about your work, about what did they want to see as of an outcome. So I think that, again, this is part of like using the tools that we use for our policies to our internal dialogue as much as possible. And we cannot expect that it's going to be like wide open doors from the get-go. I mean, we've spent now almost 10 years proving the value of this work, and we're going to continue doing it as much as possible with the right champions. It's not that we don't have champions. And I think I just want to add on the preventing the risk of embedding and diluting. Well, before getting fully into behavioral science, I was very much working on gender issues. And that was the same question. So, I mean, gender had to be mainstream because it was important, because it was an important angle, because it was an important perspective. Nobody ever questioned whether gender was going to be diluted. Providing the right toolkits, providing the right trainings, and at least helping both governments and other counterparts to use the behavioral lens, which doesn't mean that they have to be perfect, knowledgeable at using the behavioral tools, but applying a behavioral lens and acknowledging that they might need a behavioral intervention, and whether that means going and asking for help, whether it means going to you and asking for you to review what you've proposed, what they're designing. Those are actually important ways that this work scales, solidifies, and becomes part of the toolkit that everybody has as a perspective on, as Vincent was saying, what are the main psychological and other barriers that may be impacting both our beneficiaries as well as our policymakers. So we don't see this as diluting. We actually see this as needed. And that's our investment on toolkits and trainings. We have now a behavioral diagnostic toolkit. You want to do a diagnostic? Consider these questions. We have trainings on how to design, how to approach, how to question your problems. And we're now investing more and more on that because we think that this is the main, I mean, we're not going to take over the institution. We're not going to be able to be 300 behavioral science experts. I mean, we would want to, but as with impact evaluation, as with the use of data and evidence, as with everything else, this needs to become mainstream.
Thanks, Anna Maria. I might jump in for a second here before other panelists. Just make a comment from the viewpoint that I actually have across the whole UN from the Secretary General's office. And, there's been a lot of interest in behavioral science because it's part of this quintet of change in our common agenda, lots of momentum and people getting in, which is great. But I think your point you made about if you oversell behavioral science, it can almost be as detrimental as underselling it. So, this is a space for hopefully trying to create that space with senior leadership, but it doesn't mean every entity should apply behavioral science to every entity. Like, there's a lot more to think about around that too. So just wanted to frame with a bit of that. Okay, so now in the last few minutes here, Claire and Vincent, do you want to come in with response to these questions, what Anna Maria said?
Sure.
Vincent?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. On the buy-in from senior leadership, I mean, I don't have a magic recipe, but honestly, dedicating a lot of time to it, I think it took me almost a year to get the senior leadership to accept that we would try and push for behavioral science, and just coming at it from their interest. When you build the story case, their own interest, like put yourself in their shoes. Of course, better delivering your corporate results has to be there because they are accountable for corporate results, but they have also psychological traits, in particular around corporate leadership and how their institution is perceived. These high-level leaders are ship captains. They don't want the ship to crash. They don't want the ship to lose the race. So you can play a bit of loss aversion in there, and showing them that if they don't make that decision, it's going to be on them, and then there's going to be some loss associated with it. Don't tell that to my senior leadership. On the Bird Lab vision, very quickly, yeah, I think the vision of the Bird Lab is simply that behaviors are at the center of our mandate on child rights. We have a large array of behaviors: immunization, breastfeeding, hand washing, violence, discipline, positive, negative ones. So we wanted to create, it's one of the many assets that we have created to focus on behavior. And the reason we created this kind of non-physical lab is because the idea was really to collaborate, build capacity, and help each other's across the barriers of geographical sector, and break the isolation and create more of a community of practice that could help each other on advancing the agenda. Yeah, I'll leave the last minute to Claire.
Great, thanks, Vincent. Claire, over to you. I'll give you as much time as you can.
Thanks. There's not a whole lot that I can add to the comments of the colleagues. Maybe what I'll just say is that for me, the reaching the high level will really be about still operating within our program and budget, basically, and I think speaking to those, director level people across the organization who have shown interest to work with them on integrating into their work plans using some behavioral science principles here, making a plan. So getting them to integrate into their work plans specific applications of behavioral science so that they can see for themselves where it can have an impact is essentially the next step that I'll be looking at. And in terms of embedding and diluting, I would say that it's the same thing for domestic work. It's been very similar. We're trying to get other departments to take up the issue while at the same time safeguarding it to make sure that it doesn't lose its integrity. It's possible, and I think it really comes from a combination of having, new staff that are experts on the topic, but also just building up the capacity of the existing staff who really believe in the project, who believe in the ethics of it, and who can also uphold sufficient academic standards to make it meaningful.
Great, thank you for that, Claire. Okay, so we're out of time now because our next session is starting right now. So I just wanted to take 30 seconds here to thank our panelists for their many insightful remarks. There's so many themes that were brought up, lots to continue on discussion as we go. And yeah, there's some links in the chat, as I mentioned, to the Behavioral Science Week, Behavioral Science Group, Embed, UNICEF's work. So check those out if you haven't already. And yeah, looking forward to seeing you at events later this week. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you, Mary. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.